Hello everyone and welcome to my channel. My name is Crown and today we are going to have some more stories that I hope that you will enjoy. But before we start, it will be so much appreciated if you would subscribe to the channel, like the video if you enjoyed it, and maybe leave a comment down below. These simple clicks would mean a lot to the future of this channel and really reward the effort that I put in every day. And now, without further ado, let's go! First story. Scam me for $80 for cleaning on move out? I don't think so, Jack. About 10 years ago, my landlord died, or at least the person who owned the place we were renting. The property managers have been delighted, but whoever inherited wanted to sell. So the house was for sale. Enter a jerk, we will call him Jack, who decides to buy the place. Now ours was the top floor of a house, i.e. attic converted into a suite. Less than 35 square meters, 375 square feet. The bathroom was literally where the stairs up to the top floor used to be. The place was tiny. Jack came to check out the place as you should before buying a place. He had one of those Bluetooth earpieces in and I can't even remember if he even acknowledged us. He spent about 30 to 45 seconds in our suite. Next time we hear from him is about a month later. Apparently he bought the place. He stops by to give us a notice of rent increase, effective in 6 months. Legal minimum. From $485 to $795. The place is not worth that much. We say nuts to that and decide to buy a house. Since what the hell, it's not much more per month. Surprise to anyone who's never bought a house. It was more than just mortgage payments. We give him all the required notice to move out, we move and clean the place up really well. Mind you, when my partner moved in, it was not especially clean. And we happened to have the move-in inspection, which mentions this. Jack decides to try to scam us for $80 for our damage deposit for cleaning. He doesn't provide the required forms, just says I'm going to hold $80 from your damage deposit for cleaning. We respond with, no, you're not. Jack assumes we need the cash for our next damage deposit or bills and will settle for anything, and he told us, take this or I'm going to keep your whole deposit. Cue revenge. So he decides to just keep the whole deposit, $485. I filed paperwork with the rentalsman, who unsurprisingly after this investigation ruled in my favor. He's ordered to refund the whole deposit, but Jack decides not to pay. And the rentalsman doesn't have any enforcement powers. So I have to go to the local sheriff's office. They can send a legal demand letter for the deposit, plus costs. But it will cost me $100 to $150 upfront. Sure, go ahead. Jack decides to ignore the sheriff's letter. Sheriff says that they can start proceedings to recover the debt, plus costs. But I again have to pay upfront about $250. And it might take quite a while. I guess most people quit at this point, being out of pocket $700, throw in more money at the problem, and maybe having to wait months did not appeal to them. And there is also a chance you never collect. I chose to pay the sheriffs. They sent another, less friendly letter to Jack. But here is the best part. Now that they are recovering a debt, they are going to recover on all of the outstanding judgments against them. And apparently he has tried this before. They sent him another couple letters, pay up or else. And Jack chose else. Then they seized the title to Jack's giant white SUV. I can't remember what it was, but not a cheap one. They did not physically take it away or anything, but they gave him 30 days to pay all the judgments against him, or they would take it and sell it at auction. Somehow he all of a sudden found the money. My share? $485 plus $150 plus $250 all equals $885. The other people who'd registered judgments but not paid to start the collections processes were about $5,000. I can't remember how long the whole process took, but I'd say at least 6 months. Next story. It's my parking spot now. You did not use it. My cousin bought a new apartment a few years ago. It came with a parking spot, but they left the spot empty for about 2 years. Later, his wife got permanent, so they bought a car to drive her to doctor's appointments and so on. We have amazing public transport, but it's not the best option to move around for pregnant women. From time to time, they saw some cars in their spot, but they didn't care before they purchased their own. But a few weeks after purchase, they parked, and the minute they stepped out of the vehicle, some other car behind them started honking, and Karen screamed at them for parking in her spot. Yep, she thought that she earned the right to park there because they didn't use it before, so now it's hers. Because, well, she can use it better. Ha, no. They tried to explain, but Karen just continued screaming, so they gave up, wished her a nice day, and went home. Later that day, my cousin heard weird noises from the parking lot, and there was a towing truck. He ran downstairs, and you might guess which car was about to be towed. Yes, his. Karen stood there with an evil smile chatting with a police officer. Well, the smile did not last long once my cousin understood what's going on. He explained to the police officer that the car shouldn't be towed and that it's his spot and his car. Officer looked dumbfounded, and Karen went super crazy mode, screaming and cursing and yelling at everyone. The police officer did not care, just politely asked for some papers proving ownership. In a few minutes he got them, and Karen was charged for unauthorized usage of a towing truck, calling the police and lying to the authorities. She still complained but paid and never bothered my cousin and his wife again. They tried to find out later who she was, but she did not live in the apartment building, so it was maybe only a guest or someone to one of the residents. Next story. Ex-landlord tries to keep the vast majority of my security deposit, gets wrecked in court. A bit of a preface. Besides the landlord trying to underpay me, he also sent me emails prior to the court date saying that I have no chance of winning and should settle for under 50% of the total cost, claims he has never lost in court. I waited in the court lobby for nearly 2 hours, and the landlord sat close-ish to me and kept trying to make stupid banter/small talk with me. I ignored him completely. Finally got pulled into the courtroom after the office was supposed to have closed about 4 p.m. and the judge asks if there is anything she can do to help us reach an amicable settlement without having to go through the judicial process. I explained that I attempted that before any court proceedings, and the landlord would not accept my offer. His counter-offer was unreasonably low. Unfortunately, we have to do this thing. We are sworn in. Judge asks for a copy of the lease. She reads off the monthly rent amount, then a security deposit amount. She asked me when I originally sent it to the landlord, and I told her around July 4th, 2011, and the landlord confirms to her that he received it. The judge asked the landlord what he did with the security deposit. I deposited, he said. The judge explains that she needs details. What financial institution, type of account, and so on. I just deposited it into my Wells Fargo account, or whatever he said. The judge lets out an audible sigh. Mr. Tenant, were you told what financial institution this was deposited in? I explained that I was never informed. Another audible sigh. The judge asks if she can speak with each of us separately. We agree. Landlord goes first. About 10 minutes later they return and I go with the judge. I'm ready to explain all of the claims he made as to why he was keeping the money, show her all of the evidence I've documented and brought with me, brought 3 folders each with their own copies of various things. Judge closes the door to her office and explains that he is going to give me the entirety of my deposit. She explains that since he never disclosed the location of the deposit or put it on an interest-bearing account, he essentially had no case. She explains that the Pennsylvania Landlord-Tenant Act of 1951 is very specific, and the landlord has a lot of things he needs to follow. I ask if that means he will also be paying for the court fees, about $133, and she tells me that I can request that, but since this will technically be a settlement, she was being nice and not putting it in a judgment against him. But he still had to pay the full amount. She did not ask him about that, and I suggest that he pay half, as a sign of good faith, and also I wanted this nonsense to be done with. She thinks this is very reasonable. We go back into the courtroom and she explains that the landlord has agreed to pay the full amount and also informs him that he will be paying half of the court fees. The judge asks how long I'd like to give him, and she suggests 3 business days. I offer a full week because I'm way too nice, and the landlord offers to write the check right then and there. He does. I receive the check, and I return to him the uncashed check he originally tried to return me. Less than 25% of the initial deposit. In my final moments of glory, the judge again suggests to the landlord that he read up on Pennsylvania Landlord-Tenant Act of 1951, as being a landlord isn't something you should do carelessly. I pipe up and explain to him that I had already done him a favor, and I pull out the entire agreement which I had already printed up and highlighted the relevant sections. I tell him that he can keep it as I've already read it. Judge says we're free to go, and that was indeed a good day. Next story. But I didn't retire. My friend, I'll call her Sandy, worked at a travel agency in British Columbia, Canada. It was a small owner-operated business with the owner and 3 employees including my friend. Everyone worked Monday to Friday from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. One of my friend's co-workers, I'll call her Jane, an older woman in her early to mid-60s, was a long-time nuisance employee, among other sketchy behavior. Jane was always scamming ways to take time off over and above her official paid vacation time. In order to make up for the lost hours, she would claim overtime hours/pay by supposedly going into the office in her off hours to finish up work without being requested by the owner to do so. Despite being caught on her own lies on a number of occasions and being warned about trying to claim for unsanctioned overtime, the owner of the travel agency was reluctant to officially reprimand Jane or get rid of her. The reason being is the owner discovered after she had hired Jane that Jane had actually been fired from her previous job and another local travel agency for pulling the same stunt. However, Jane had sued her former employer for unfair dismissal and had won a settlement. After a few years of my friend Sandy working at the travel agency, the owner was ready to retire and offered to sell the business to my friend. Sandy took her up on the deal and took over the business while keeping on Jane and the other employee. Once again, just as the previous owner was afraid to get rid of Jane, so was Sandy for fear of being sued. When Sandy took over the business, she instituted guidelines regarding taking time off, and she established an official no overtime policy. Jane would still try with her shenanigans, but was far less successful in getting what she wanted with her friend in charge. However, Jane still had one trick up her sleeve, but she wanted to take time off on a whim. Sandy was a divorced single mom of 2 boys who were heavily involved in youth hockey. She would sometimes leave the office an hour or 2 before closing to get her boys to hockey practice or a game. In order to avoid requesting in person or potentially being denied, Jane would wait for Sandy to be out of the office to book a day off if she didn't feel like coming into work or had made plans. Sandy would then arrive at work the next morning only to discover that Jane wasn't coming in. Despite this happening a number of times, Sandy would usually let it slide since there was now a definite no overtime policy. Therefore, Jane could no longer claim to come in to work on the weekend or after hours in order to try and make up for the day off. She would either miss out on a day's pay, in turn saving Sandy money as the owner, and it would come out of her remaining paid vacation days. Moreover, 2 people in the office at one time could usually handle everything. Jane not coming in was really a no-loss situation for Sandy. There was one time, however, when Sandy was going to be away for 1 or 2 work days just before the weekend to take her boys to a hockey tournament. She told both Jane and the other employee both verbally and in writing that they could not book time off for the dates in question since she would be away and needed both of them in the office. Within a few days of giving this notice, Sandy went into the office on a Saturday to do some paperwork and go through the sales for the week. And this is when she discovered that only the day before, Jane had booked a trip for her daughter and son-in-law to Las Vegas as well as a plane ticket in her name to Calgary where her daughter lived. Both a trip to Vegas and a ticket to Calgary coincided with the date Sandy would be out of the office. Sandy then checked the vacation booking schedule to further discover that Jane had indeed booked the days off that she had expressly been told she couldn't have. Not mentioning she had discovered the travel Jane had booked for herself or her daughter, Sandy emailed Jane telling her she would have to deny her the days off, since she had already been told they were unavailable because she, Sandy, would be away and needed Jane in the office. Through a continued series of email exchanges, Jane replied and outright lied to Sandy with some excuse about her daughter getting some long-awaited medical treatment or surgery, and she needed to go to Calgary to help out for a few days, and also look after her granddaughter. Sandy replied to this lie by telling Jane she knew about the trip she had booked to Vegas for her daughter and son-in-law, that Jane's trip to Calgary was most likely to babysit her granddaughter while her daughter was in Vegas, and that she would still have to deny Jane the days off, especially since she booked them after being told they were unavailable. Jane countered in her subsequent reply without even addressing the fact that she had been caught in a lie, that she had been a dedicated employee of the travel agency for several years and couldn't understand why she was being treated so unfairly after all she had done for the business. She then wrote that since she wasn't being treated as a valued employee, she had no choice but to retire and was given her 2 weeks' notice. Despite Jane's threat, Sandy replied that she would still be unable to grant her the days off and left it at that without making any mention of Jane's threat to quit or retire. Sandy then contacted her accountant, who also acted as her de facto business advisor, and explained what had happened with Jane. Also aware of Jane's previous shenanigans, Sandy's accountant told her that this was the out she had been looking for with Jane, and she had it all in writing. He told her that Jane had essentially resigned/retired and all Sandy needed to do was honor Jane's desire to do so, let her finish out her 2 weeks, or pay her 2 weeks' wages in lieu with no further severance pay legally required since she hadn't been fired. The following Monday, Sandy went into the office early accompanied by her longtime partner to act as a witness. She put Jane's belongings from her desk into a box and took the things that were property of the business. Since Jane was old school and had resisted inputting client information in the computer database, this also included a small box filled with index cards which had client phone numbers, addresses, credit card information, and other personal information noted on them. In the meantime, the other employee had arrived for work, and they all waited for Jane to show up. Jane arrived just before 9, acting as though nothing had happened, and greeted everyone with a good morning as she walked through the door. However, she was apparently taken slightly aback when she noticed Sandy's partner seated in the far corner of the office. At this point, Jane was midway to her desk when Sandy informed her that there was no need to go any further and that she had accepted Jane's notification of retirement. She then handed Jane a check compensating her for hours she had worked in the current pay period, as well as 2 weeks' wages in lieu of Jane finishing out her final 2 weeks before her retirement. And Jane was dumbfounded. I went into panic mode. "But I didn't retire. I'm not ready to retire." Sandy responded that indeed she had retired, given her notice and had proof of it in writing. All Jane could do was continue repeating, "But I didn't retire. I am not ready to retire," while unsuccessfully attempting to get the support of the other employee who refused to come to her defense. Sandy then pointed to the box containing Jane's belongings, wished her a happy retirement, and told her to leave the office. Jane quickly rifled through the box and noticed that the small box containing the index cards with client information was not there. She insisted that Sandy return it to her, which Sandy refused to do, explaining that it was property of the business, contained personal client information, and that she would be in violation of Canadian privacy laws if she were to let Jane take it. Jane's shock had now turned to obstinance and she refused to leave without the box. Both the other employee and Sandy's partner had started to get involved, repeatedly telling Jane to just leave. Sandy then informed Jane that if she didn't leave, they would have to call the RCMP Canadian police, at which point Sandy's partner dialed 911 to inform the dispatcher of a disgruntled former employee at XYZ travel agency who was refusing to leave the premises. Within a few minutes, 2 police officers arrived, and Jane immediately ran to the door ranting about being fired and about the missing box of client information. In order to de-escalate the situation, one police officer told Jane to come outside and explain to him her side of the story. The other officer remained in the office to hear Sandy's side of the story, agreeing that Jane was not legally entitled to the box of client's information. The other officer then re-entered the business and told Jane to wait outside. He said that Jane was insisting that Sandy was holding onto her personal belongings, namely a box of important information. Both Sandy and the officer who had spoken to her explained the contents of the box to the other officer, who in turn agreed it was not Jane's property. The police officers then picked up the large box of Jane's personal belongings, took it outside to Jane, and told her she needed to go home. To rub salt in Jane's wounds, the next day, Sandy put up a large sign in the window on the business congratulating Jane on her retirement, and even put a small announcement in the local newspaper doing the same thing. The icing on a piece of revenge cake was Sandy, when filing out the necessary government forms for when an employee quits, gets fired, or retires, made sure to check the box labeled "retired" for the reason for Jane no longer being employed. By doing so, Jane was ineligible to collect unemployment insurance benefits. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching and see you next time.